The bank teller's face went the color of copy paper. Not pale the way people go pale when they feel sick. I mean white. Genuinely white, like the blood had simply evacuated. She stared at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen, and her hand shot up to wave over her manager before I even had time to register what was happening. "Ma'am," she said, and her voice cracked on the second syllable. "Ma'am, please, you need to come with me. Right now." I was standing there in a Walmart hoodie I'd bought with the last $23 in my checking account, holding my dead father's debit card between two fingers like it might dissolve, with nothing to my name but a duffel bag in my car and a hamster cage wedged in the back seat. I had not slept in 31 hours, and the look on that woman's face made my knees go soft. But let me back up, because none of that makes sense without the 8 years that came before it. My name is Nora Callahan, though I spent 8 years being Nora Whitfield, which is a name I am very happy to be done with. I'm 33 years old, I write code for a living, and I spent the better part of my adult life believing that I had built something real in a place most people don't even know exists. Harlan Creek is a rotational work settlement about 40 miles north of Fairbanks, Alaska. Most people picture Alaska as wilderness and silence and the occasional bear. Harlan Creek is that, plus a grid of prefab housing units, a commissary that doubles as a grocery store, a medical clinic staffed by one overworked PA, and a population that fluctuates between 600 and 900, depending on what the pipeline contractors are doing that season. It's not a town exactly. It's more like a town that never finished deciding what it wanted to be. The winters last so long that by February, you start talking to your houseplants just to hear something respond. I moved there at 24, following a job with a remote infrastructure company that needed someone to maintain their internal systems. The pay was exceptional for someone my age, $98,000 a year, plus housing stipend, plus cost of living adjustments that made the number look even better on paper. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself 2 years, maybe 3, and then I'd move somewhere with real restaurants and a movie theater that wasn't a projector screen in the community center. Then I met Garrett Whitfield at the commissary in the middle of July, when the sun was doing that maddening Arctic summer thing, where it simply refuses to set, and everything looks bleached and eternal and a little unreal. He was buying coffee and a voltage meter. I was buying coffee and pretending I wasn't crying because my laptop had just died and taken 3 weeks of work with it. He offered to look at the laptop. I said it was beyond saving. He said he'd worked on worse. He was right. Garrett was a mechanical engineer on a 6-month rotation with one of the pipeline maintenance contractors. He was 31, broad-shouldered, quiet in a way I initially mistook for depth. He had this habit of listening to you speak with his whole face, like what you were saying was genuinely the most interesting thing happening in the world at that moment. I was lonely, in the way that people get lonely in isolated places. Not dramatically, not obviously, just hollowed out in small, daily ways. And his attention felt like sunlight. We dated through that summer. He extended his rotation. By the following spring, we were talking about staying. I want to be clear about something. I loved him. I'm not writing this to reframe 8 years of my life as a mistake I was too stupid to see. I loved Garrett Whitfield in a real, inconvenient, rearrange your whole life kind of way. I chose him with open eyes. What I did not choose, and what I did not see clearly until it was far too late, was his sister. Renata Whitfield was 4 years younger than Garrett, 27 when I first met her, a dental hygienist in Spokane with a voice like a page being torn slowly out of a book. She came up to visit us the summer after Garrett and I got married. A small, practical ceremony in the Harlan Creek Community Center, July again, the midnight sun painting everything that flat gold color that looks beautiful in photographs and slightly wrong in person. Renata sat in the front row and smiled the whole time, and later I would replay that smile and understand that I had misread it completely. She was friendly to me that first visit, complimentary even. She admired the house. We'd upgraded from the base housing to a private rental on the north edge of the settlement, a 2-story prefab with actual wood floors and a decent kitchen. She asked thoughtful questions about my work, She brought me a succulent in a terracotta pot, which died within 2 weeks because I forgot to water it, but which I kept the pot of for years out of some guilty obligation. The trouble was so quiet at first that I genuinely did not recognize it as trouble. It started with small comments. Renata called maybe twice a month, always when Garrett was home, and she had this particular skill for making observations that sounded neutral and landed like thumbtacks. "Garrett mentioned you've been really busy with work lately. I hope you're not overdoing it. I noticed you guys didn't come down for Thanksgiving again. I know Alaska makes everything complicated." That last one she said with a tone that suggested Alaska was a choice I was personally making to inconvenience the family, rather than a place we both lived and worked. Garrett laughed it off when I brought it up. "That's just how she talks," he said. "She doesn't mean anything by it." I believed him for longer than I should have. The financial piece crept in so slowly that I keep trying to identify the exact moment it started, and I genuinely cannot. It wasn't one decision. It was 100 small ones, spread across years, each one reasonable in isolation. In year 2 of our marriage, Garrett suggested we consolidate our finances. One joint account, simpler, more efficient. I agreed. I made significantly more than he did. My base salary had grown to $114,000 by then, plus bonuses, and he was between rotations, so it seemed practical, caring even. In year 3, Garrett started working for himself, consulting independently rather than through a contractor. The income was less stable, he explained. Could we put a larger portion of my paycheck toward the shared household fund, just to smooth things out while he built up his client base? Of course, I said. Of course. In year 4, he suggested I remove myself from one of my investment accounts and consolidate it with a joint brokerage he'd set up. Better tax treatment, he said. More streamlined. He'd read about it. I didn't look at the paperwork as carefully as I should have. I was in the middle of a brutal sprint at work, migrating an entire server architecture before the winter maintenance window closed, and I signed things at the kitchen table while my eyes were still full of code. I want to be clear. I am a programmer. I am not a stupid woman. I can debug a system failure at 2 in the morning with a mug of cold coffee and 0 documentation. But the same analytical mind that makes me good at my job made me trust the logic of each individual step without seeing the overall pattern. Each change was reasonable. Each change was small. It took me until year 6 to realize that the reasonable small changes had added up to something that looked, from the outside, very much like a trap. By year 6, I had nominal access to one checking account that Garrett managed, a credit card with a $2,000 limit that I never used because we shared expenses, and essentially no independent financial footprint. My salary went into the joint account. Bills came out of the joint account. Whatever was left, Garrett managed. I asked about the investment accounts occasionally and got answers that were just technical enough to seem credible and just vague enough to prevent follow-up. I had also, somewhere in those years, let my independent professional network atrophy. Remote work in an isolated settlement does that. Your world contracts. I had colleagues I emailed, no one I could call. The hamster appeared in year 5. Our son, Garrett's from a previous relationship, Kieran, who was 9 when I met him and 17 by the time our marriage ended, had gone through a phase of desperately wanting a dog. The settlement rules didn't allow dogs over 30 pounds, and Kieran wanted a husky, which is basically an argument against its own existence. We compromised on a dwarf hamster that Kieran named Bolt. Bolt was gray and fast, and lived in a cage on Kieran's dresser, and had absolutely no idea that the household he occupied was slowly coming apart at every seam. Kieran, for his part, was a good kid, quiet like his dad. He and I had a real relationship. I helped him with his math homework for years, and when he got into coding in 9th grade, we spent whole evenings at the kitchen table with him learning Python while I worked. By the time he was 16, he was better at certain things than I was, which I told him, and which made him glow in that teenage way where they're trying not to show they're pleased. It was Kieran, actually, who first said something that stopped me cold. It was late June, the summer before everything fell apart. Kieran was 17 and preparing to leave for a pre-college program in Fairbanks. He was in the kitchen packing a bag, and Renata was on the phone with Garrett in the next room. She'd been calling more frequently that spring, 3-4 times a week, always in the evening, always in a room I wasn't in. I'd stopped asking about the calls because asking had started to produce a particular expression on Garrett's face that I did not like and could not quite name. Kieran zipped his bag, looked at me for a moment, and then said, very quietly, "Nora, do you know about the Juno account?" I looked at him. "The what?" He looked at the doorway. Garrett's voice was audible, but not the words. Kieran shook his head slightly, like he'd already changed his mind. "Never mind," he said. "Forget I said it." "Kieran." "I'm not supposed to know either," he said, and he picked up his bag and walked out. I stood in that kitchen with the midnight sun pressing through the window at 11 o'clock at night, turning everything gold and wrong, and I felt something click into place in the center of my chest. Not a good click, the kind of click that sounds like a lock engaging from the outside. I didn't say anything to Garrett that night. I smiled through dinner. I helped Kieran load his things into the truck the next morning. I waved as they drove away down the access road, dust rising in the dry summer heat. And then I went to my laptop and started looking. I found the Juno account in 40 minutes. It wasn't hidden well, not from someone who knew how to trace a digital paper trail. Garrett had used the same password structure he used for everything. I'd watched him type it 100 times without thinking about what I was seeing. The brokerage account he'd moved my investments into had a linked transfer history, and the transfers told a story he had never told me. Over the course of 4 years, $340,000 had moved in small, irregular increments, never enough to trigger an automatic fraud flag, always just under the threshold, to a savings account at a Juno credit union held in the name of Renata Whitfield. I sat with that number for a long time. I looked at it the way you look at a word you've written so many times, it stops looking like a word. $340,000. My salary. My bonuses. The investment account I'd signed over at the kitchen table while my eyes were full of code. I did not call Garrett. I did not cry. I opened a new document and started building a spreadsheet. I want to tell you that what I felt in that moment was rage, because that's a clean emotion, a useful one. But it wasn't rage. It was something colder. It was the particular clarity you get when a system you've been troubleshooting for years finally produces an error code you can actually read. Something in me went very quiet and very precise. I spent the next 6 hours documenting everything. Transfer dates, amounts, account numbers, timestamps. I screenshot every screen twice, saved everything to a personal cloud account I'd opened years ago for work backups, and never mentioned to Garrett. By the time the sun was still bright at 2 in the morning, because that's Alaska in late June, the sun doesn't care what time it is, I had a folder with 47 files and a very clear picture of what had been done to me. Then I made one phone call, not to a friend, not to a family member, to my father. My dad, Dennis Callahan, had been a contracts attorney for 30 years before he retired to a small house in Bend, Oregon, with a vegetable garden and a subscription to 3 different legal databases that he still read for fun. He was 68, sharp as a straight edge, and he picked up on the second ring even though it was past midnight his time. "Nora," he said, not a question. "Dad," I said, "I need you to help me understand something." I told him what I'd found. He listened without interrupting, which is a skill most people never develop, and lawyers either have completely or not at all. When I finished, he was quiet for about 15 seconds. "How liquid are you right now?" he asked. "I have about $800 in my personal checking and a credit card with a $2,000 limit." "Okay," he said, "don't touch the joint account. Don't transfer anything, don't withdraw anything, don't do anything that looks like dissipation of marital assets. Get yourself an Anchorage attorney tomorrow morning. Family law, someone who handles financial concealment cases. I'll send you 3 names in the next hour." "Dad," and "Nora," he said, Come home when this is done, okay? Just come home." I had not cried yet. I cried then. Not for long, but enough. He sent the names in 40 minutes. I had an appointment with the first one, a woman named Patricia Okafor, Family Law and Forensic Financial Cases, Anchorage, by 9 the next morning over video call. Patricia Okafor was 51, direct as a tax return, and she had the particular energy of someone who had seen every version of this story and was still angry on behalf of every person it happened to. Within 20 minutes of reviewing my documentation, she said, "This is textbook financial abuse paired with asset concealment. The Juno account is the cleanest piece of evidence I've seen in 3 years. Can I get it back?" I asked. "The 340? "We can make a very compelling argument," she said. "Alaska courts take marital waste seriously. The question is how much of it Renata has spent." That was a question I didn't have an answer to yet. The divorce process took 9 months, which anyone who has been through a contested financial case will tell you is actually not that long. Garrett did not take it gracefully. When I filed, served through his contractor's HR office because that was the address on record, he called me 17 times in one evening. I let all 17 go to voicemail. I listened to them later, with Patricia on the line, and they were useful. The escalating quality of them, the way his voice shifted from disbelief to anger to something that sounded very close to desperation, was its own kind of documentation. Renata called once. I picked up that one. "You're destroying this family," she said without preamble. I thought about 8 years of thumbtack comments. I thought about $340,000 moved in increments small enough not to trigger a flag. I thought about Kieran in the kitchen, zipping his bag, telling me to forget he'd said anything. "Renata," I said, "I want you to think very carefully about what you say next. You're speaking to someone whose attorney has subpoenaed your bank records." She hung up. The forensic accountant Patricia hired, a compact, meticulous man named Gerald Fitch, who wore the same style of navy cardigan in every video meeting, determined that of the $340,000 transferred to Renata's account, approximately $218,000 remained. The rest had gone into a down payment on a house in Spokane and a series of expenses that Renata and Garrett had apparently agreed constituted a family loan, which was documented nowhere because it was not a loan. It was theft with a softer name. The deposition happened over video in February. By then, I had moved out of the Harlan Creek house. Patricia had advised me to leave the marital residence voluntarily to avoid complications, and I'd driven down to Fairbanks and found a furnished studio apartment, and I was watching Garrett on a screen in my kitchen while snow came down outside and the temperature sat at 11 below zero. He looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I just had a better angle on him now. Patricia asked him to explain the transfer history. He said it was a loan to his sister. Patricia asked him to produce the loan documentation. He said it was informal. She asked him to explain why a $340,000 informal loan to his sister had not been disclosed on either of the 2 financial affidavits he had filed with the court. He said he hadn't thought it was relevant. "You didn't think $340,000 was relevant," Patricia said, in the exact tone of someone who has been waiting for that answer for months. He didn't have anything useful after that. The settlement conference was in April. Garrett's attorney, a man who had the energy of someone billing by the hour and not enjoying the case, tried twice to characterize the Juno transfers as a pre-existing family financial arrangement that predated our marriage. Patricia produced Gerald Fitch's analysis, showing that every single transfer occurred after our joint account was established, using funds that were demonstrably sourced from my salary deposits. The judge, a methodical woman named the Honorable Sandra Beaumont, asked Garrett's attorney if he had documentation to support the premarital characterization. He said he would need to gather additional records. Judge Beaumont gave him 10 days. He did not produce anything in 10 days because there was nothing to produce. The final order came down in May. Garrett was required to repay $340,000 in full, drawn against his share of the marital assets, which included the Harlan Creek rental property we'd put both our names on in year 3, and which had appreciated considerably over 8 years, in a settlement where housing was perpetually scarce. Renata, as a third party who had received and retained funds she knew or should have known were marital assets, was subject to a separate civil judgment. My attorney filed it the same afternoon the divorce order was signed. In total, between the property settlement, the asset recovery, and a small amount of additional damages Patricia had argued successfully on the grounds of financial misconduct, I walked out of that process with approximately $510,000 and my salary, my career, and my name. Nora Callahan again. Just Nora Callahan. Which brings me back to the bank teller. By the time I drove down to Bend to stay with my father, he had been sick for 6 weeks with something the doctors were still characterizing carefully. He looked thinner than I'd expected, and he made bad jokes about it, which was how I knew he was scared. The day after I arrived, he handed me an envelope with my name on it in his handwriting. "Your grandfather opened that account in 1987, he said. "I added to it over the years. I kept meaning to tell you about it, and then I kept not telling you about it because I wanted you to make your own way. And then you did make your own way, rather spectacularly, so I think the timing is fine." Inside the envelope was a debit card, old style, the kind with raised numbers, and a slip of paper with a PIN and a balance. The balance was $412,000. I drove to the nearest branch of the bank the next morning because I needed to see it with my own eyes, in person, on a screen I could touch. I was wearing a Walmart hoodie because I hadn't unpacked yet. I had a duffel bag in my car and Bolt the hamster in his cage in the back seat because Kieran had asked me to take Bolt when he left for his pre-college program, and I had not yet figured out where we were going to land permanently, and Bolt had been through enough transitions that one more didn't seem to bother him. I handed the teller the card. She was a young woman, maybe 25, with a name tag that said Deja. She ran it through the system, looked at the screen, and went the color of copy paper. "Ma'am," she said, and her voice cracked, "Ma'am, please, you need to come with me, right now." What I had not known, and what Deja and her manager explained to me in a small office with a glass wall and a potted plant that was doing better than any plant I'd ever owned, was that the account had been collecting interest since 1987 under a compounding structure that my grandfather had apparently negotiated with a banker he'd known personally, the kind of arrangement that simply does not exist anymore. My father's regular additions had interacted with that compounding over 37 years in a way that Gerald Fitch, when I called him later that afternoon from the parking lot, described as genuinely unusual, in the careful voice of a man who does not like to use the word remarkable. The actual balance, as of that morning, was not $412,000. It was $412,000 in the principal account, plus accumulated interest across a linked savings instrument that had been quietly doing its work since before I was born. Total, $1,147,000. I sat in that office with the glass wall for a long time after they told me. Deja brought me water. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I think I had used up a specific reserve of crying in the previous 12 months, and my body had simply decided to redistribute the resources elsewhere. My father recovered. It took 8 months and 2 rounds of treatment and a lot of bad jokes, and his vegetable garden died while he wasn't paying attention to it. But he recovered. We replanted the garden the following spring. He told me I had no instinct for spacing the rows correctly, which is true. I took a remote position with a cybersecurity firm based in Portland, fully remote, $138,000 base plus equity. I found a house in Bend, 3 miles from my dad, with enough yard for a real garden and a room I turned into an office with a door that closes, which feels like an extraordinary luxury after years of working at a kitchen table that was also someone else's kitchen table. Kieran emails me. He's studying computer science at University of Alaska Fairbanks now, 19 years old, and he sends me debugging questions at odd hours the way I used to send them to my senior colleagues at 24. I answer them. Last month he sent me a message that just said, "I'm glad you found it. The account. I'm glad it worked out. I wrote back, "You're the one who told me to look." He said, "I didn't tell you anything." I said, "Exactly." Bolt lived to be 3 years and 4 months old, which is a respectable age for a dwarf hamster. He died on a Tuesday in October, peaceful, in his cage by the window with the afternoon sun on him. I buried him in the backyard in a shoebox. I stood there for a minute in the cold and thought about everything he had seen from that back seat, the Fairbanks studio, the drive south, the parking lot where I sat with a phone pressed to my ear being told a number I couldn't fit inside my understanding yet. He had been a very small witness to a very large year.